This presentation summarises the history and development of Brookwood Cemetery. Given the time constraints, it is necessarily selective, but I hope it will give a flavour of the wide range of people and communities represented in Brookwood Cemetery. The origins of Brookwood Cemetery date back to the middle of the 19th century. In particular, deaths arising from the cholera epidemic of 1848 to 49, which caused a crisis of congestion in churchyards and burial grounds across the country. And this was especially true in urban areas, and most particularly in London. One direct consequence, since cholera killed rich and poor alike, resulted in the Metropolitan Interments Act of 1850. This granted the General Board of Health powers to effectively nationalise burials within the Metropolitan Burial District, which is shown on this map. This scheme was promoted by the General Board of Health's Secretary, Edwin Chadwick, in an attempt to solve the dead man's question. But it came to nothing, with the exception of the acquisition of Brompton Cemetery, because the Treasury became increasingly anxious about the costs of purchasing the existing privately owned cemeteries and other properties which were required to make the scheme work. Therefore, in 1852, the Act was repealed and replaced by another, which enabled London vestries to either engage cemetery companies to bury their dead or otherwise establish and manage their own burial grounds. Most vestries chose the latter course, and subsequently this Act was extended to the rest of the country. Another direct consequence of the cholera panic was that another plan was promoted to establish a new cemetery beyond Chadwick's Metropolitan Burial District. This plan was called the London Necropolis and National Mausoleum, and a provisional company was established in 1851, and in June 1852 its Act of Incorporation was passed by Parliament. This granted powers to establish a cemetery in Woking, nearly 30 miles from central London. This map shows the lands acquired by the Necropolis Company following the passage of its Act. These lands were owned by Lord Onslow and were deemed to be of little value. Therefore, the company paid about £25 an acre for 2,200 acres. You can see how extensive the estate was and how it included areas detached from the main section to the left. The new cemetery was laid out into two areas. The upper triangular section, closest to the main railway line, was designated for nonconformists and is now known as the North Cemetery, whilst the larger portion below was reserved for Church of England funerals and is now designated the South Cemetery. A private cemetery station was constructed to serve each of these sections. And you can also see the siding or branch line that fed back from the main railway line to serve both parts of the cemetery. The scheme involved the construction of station facilities in London and at Woking, because a distinguishing and necessary feature of the plan was to convey coffins and mourners by rail. Just outside Waterloo, a private station was constructed. This shows the entrance to the second of these stations, which was opened in 1902. It served the Necropolis Company through to the Second World War. From here, funeral trains were operated down the main line and then reversed into Brookwood Cemetery, calling first at North Station and then south. For about 90 years, these stations were the entrances to the cemetery for most visitors. Nearby were the chapels where funeral services were held as required. Although the Companies Act was passed in 1852, the cemetery did not open until the 13th of November 1854. The first burials were those of paupers from the parish of St Saviour's, Southwark. The Bishop of Winchester, shown here in an official portrait, had consecrated the cemetery on the 7th of November. And we should remember that in 1854, his diocese stretched from the Solent to the South Bank. Two areas of the cemetery were reserved for burials from St Saviour's, designated by these cast iron boundary markers. The first burial was of the stillborn twin boys of Mr. and Mrs. Hoare, who lived in Ewer Street. All these burials may be seen as representative of other London parishes that used Brookwood for the burial of their poor. And during the 19th century, the majority of burials at Brookwood, at least 70 to 75%, were pauper burials. The first private burial took place later in November 1854, when Lieutenant General Sir Henry Goldfinch was buried in the Church of England section near to the Anglican chapel. Goldfinch was a veteran of the Peninsular War, serving under the Duke of Wellington, and his battle honours are listed on his headstone. The size of the cemetery meant that a number of churches, institutions, friendly societies and other groups established their own community burial grounds at Brookwood. One of the earliest sections was that reserved by the Dramatic, Equestrian and Musical Sick Fund Association, otherwise known as the Actors Acre. It is shown here in a painting commissioned some years ago by Jenny Bissett, a member of the Brookwood Cemetery Society. The Sick Fund provided burial facilities for its members. One of the reasons why Brookwood was chosen is that the Necropolis Company allowed funerals to take place on Sundays. This was important to actors since it allowed them to attend funerals without taking time away from the theatre. Another reason was that the Royal Dramatic College had recently opened nearby to provide accommodation for retired actors. Some of the former inmates of the college are buried in this plot. Adjacent to the Actors Acre is the Swedish burial ground, also established in 1857. This burial ground is still used today. Its entrance is marked by two stone obelisks, one of which has the inscription in English and the other has the inscription in Swedish. Nearby is the first Roman Catholic burial grounds serving South London, and this was opened in 1859. Originally, the ground was graced with a central cross, which has not survived. Also opened in 1859 was this ground reserved for the Oddfellows Society, another friendly society providing burial facilities for its members. This fine memorial gives details of the inauguration of the ground, along with some fascinating symbolism on the base of the obelisk. Considerably more exotic was the opening of the Parsi ground in 1862. This was occasioned by the death of a member of the Parsi community in London and the need to provide appropriate burial facilities. The site selected was, in 1862, an isolated part of the cemetery surrounded by pine woods. The ground is still in use today, administered by the Zoroastrian Trust Funds of Europe. At the end of the 19th century, the Parsi ground was redesigned to recommendations made by Sir George Birdwood and based on traditional plans of the Persian paradise. This mausoleum, commemorating the life of Nowrozji Wadia, is also symbolic, with its stepped base representing the seven-staged heavenly mountain, from which four paths lead east, south, west and north through the burial ground. This is the burial ground of St Alban the Martyr in Holborn, which opened in 1863. St Albans was a new church, and because of its location in central London, there was no space for a churchyard. So the church made inquiries with cemetery companies for burial space. The Great Northern Cemetery was considered, but Brookwood was selected because its fees were similar and because the Necropolis Company allocated an acre of land for St Albans' exclusive use free of charge. At the end of the 19th century, this attractive lich gate was erected at the entrance to the ground as a memorial to a parishioner, John Milner Bridges. This plaque may be found on the exterior wall of the cemetery chapel. It commemorates the life of John Lynch, an Irish patriot who died in Woking prison in June 1866. This plaque may be seen as representing some of the other institutions, including hospitals, asylums, workhouses, other prisons and similar institutions which used Brookwood as a burial ground. These deceased lie in unmarked and unremembered graves in the extensive, silent and apparently empty spaces on the cemetery boundaries with Pirbright. Woking Prison had opened in 1860 with over 300 male inmates. In 1869, a female prison was opened beside the original building. The male prison closed in 1889 and the female prison in 1895. Both buildings were then taken over by the War Department and converted into the Inkerman Barracks. This too used Brookwood Cemetery from time to time. Following the closure of the Royal Dramatic College in 1880, the premises were acquired by Dr. W. G. Leitner and converted for use as the Oriental Institute, which opened in 1884. To serve the spiritual needs of the community, the mosque was commissioned and built nearby. But Dr. Leitner also provided a burial ground for his community, and this forms the nucleus of the old Muslim burial ground at Brookwood. In July 2019, a ceremony took place to commemorate this ground with its own blue plaque shown here. Immediately behind the plaque is the original central Qibla stone, which records the fact that the surrounding ground was reserved for use by the Oriental Institute, whilst the other side of the stone gives instructions for the burial of Muslims. Several notable Muslims, including English converts to Islam, are buried in this ground, all fully described in the excellent and informative trail leaflets produced by the Everyday Muslim Project in 2019. In addition to railway funerals, the London Necropolis Company also pioneered disposable coffins. Originally devised by Sir Francis Seymour Hayden as an alternative to cremation, he had suggested the use of wicker coffins. The Necropolis Company patented its own version, called earth-to-earth coffins, but made of papier-mâché. Externally, these could be finished to resemble conventional coffins, but once buried, they quickly disintegrated, and the body could be broken down into its natural constituents by the soil. Today, we would refer to these as environmentally friendly or green coffins. This impressive memorial is a cenotaph in memory of Roop Singh. He was an Indian jockey who travelled to this country with Maharaj Sir Pratap Singh in the spring of 1887 to celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Regrettably, he died of malarious fever in May, shortly after arriving in England. His subsequent cremation at Woking was the first arranged by the Necropolis Company at the recently opened crematorium at St John's, which had only been in operation for 2 years. Roop Singh was the 17th person to be cremated at Woking. And despite all appearances, his ashes are not here in this grave, but were scattered over water. In the same year, Charles Warne died, a noted archaeologist of Dorset. This remarkable memorial was erected in the form of a prehistoric henge and barrow, which is even more astonishing for being in the Church of England section, yet representing forms of prehistoric burial and commemoration. Charles Bradlaw was the first atheist MP to sit in the House of Commons. The plaque on the left is taken from his statue in Northampton and cites the years he served the constituency. In fact, he was not permitted to sit in the Commons until 1886, when, with a change of government and a new speaker, he was at last able to take his seat without further interference. He died in 1891 and is buried on Chapel Hill in the North Cemetery. At the end of the 19th century, the Roman Catholic plots were extended and included the circular plot 124, within which was constructed a chapel. It is shown here, recently restored, but is not in its original form because it was gutted by fire in 1989. It was subsequently rebuilt, but in a simplified form, and in doing so lost its bell. The beginning of the 20th century saw the provision of a new columbarium in the cemetery, as shown here. The columbarium was converted by the Necropolis Company from a family mausoleum in 1910, with the first ashes being placed within in 1912. Some of the first soldiers to be buried at Brookwood during the First World War can be found adjacent to the old Muslim burial ground we saw earlier. These men were badly injured in France and brought back to military hospitals on the south coast. The earliest burials date from November 1914, underlining the important actions these soldiers took part in at the beginning of the war. After 1915, subsequent burials took place in the dedicated Muslim burial ground on Horsell Common. The British military cemetery came later and was opened for the burial of servicemen and servicewomen who died in hospitals in the London military district. This ground came into use from 1917. The Indigent Muslims Burial Association was founded in 1927. It raised money to provide Muslim burials and for the upkeep of their graves. It is probably the first British Muslim charity, and the East London Mosque houses its archive. From this illustration, we can see that the first 2 burials recorded at Brookwood predate the creation of the association, being in 1925 and 1926. During the Second World War, the military cemetery was expanded considerably to include sections for the Canadian forces and various national sections, including the Free French, the Poles, the Czechs, and the Belgians. The first major post-war development was the opening of the Glades of Remembrance for the reception of cremated remains. Although the first ashes date from 1947, the Glades were not formally dedicated until May 1950. Designed by the landscape architect Edward White, the Glades were conceived as being unmonumental in contrast with the rest of the cemetery. The Necropolis Company correctly surmised that there would be an increased demand for cremation after the war, and also planned to open a crematorium on the land opposite the entrance to the Glades. However, they failed to do so, and Brookwood remains without a crematorium. The London station of the Necropolis Company was largely destroyed by enemy action in 1941, but the cemetery stations continued in use as refreshment rooms for funeral parties and visitors to the cemetery through to the 1960s. North Station was demolished at the end of the 1960s. South Station was vandalised in September 1972, when it was largely destroyed by fire. The remains of the station were demolished shortly afterwards, there being little interest either in the story of the railway or the cemetery at that time. In 1975, the new owners of the cemetery, Maximilian Investments Limited, promoted the Brookwood Cemetery Act. This allowed them to sell cemetery land. The consequences of this act are still with us because it led to the fragmentation of the landscape and its management. Some of the areas sold off shortly after the act was passed include the original cemetery offices and workshop area, now dominated by the Red House office block and its car park, the 11 acres off St Mark's Avenue, which were purchased by the old Woking clay pigeon shoot, and 2 areas for residential use off Cemetery Pales. Another area was sold to the Dalwoody Borough community in the late 1970s. This plot is located in the North Cemetery and includes the former chapel building and the site of North Station. A similar area was sold to the St Edward Brotherhood in 1982, which includes the former Anglican chapels and the site of South Station. The Brotherhood is an Orthodox monastic community which holds regular services in its church and runs an Orthodox cemetery. Part of this is operated by the Serbian Church in London. Another section was reserved for the Bhagava Trust, which was established in 1984. This comprises most of the old Plot 1, but some of the burials date from the late 1970s, predating the foundation of the Trust. These graves are among the first Muslim burials to take place in the South Cemetery. Around the same time, the Ismaili Cemetery was established in Plot 71 and incorporating the old railway track bed in this section. The burial ground has since been extended along the former track bed at the foot of Plots 72 and 73. There have been some important strategic developments in the last few years. In 2009, English Heritage, as it was then, designated Brookwood a Grade 1 listed historic park and garden. 2 of the reasons for this upgrade were, 1, its wide diversity of social and religious aspects, and secondly, its strong international links. Grade 1 status places Brookwood in the top 10% of registered historic parks and gardens in the UK, and thereby reinforces its position as a significant heritage asset in the borough of Woking. Since 1974, Brookwood was managed by a succession of private owners. This came to an end in December 2014 when Woking Borough Council acquired the shares in the company and took control of the cemetery. At the same time, they established their own company, the Woking Necropolis and Mausoleum Limited. And since then, they have undertaken a wide range of restoration and repair works across the cemetery, including the complete repair and restoration of several significant mausoleums, such as the columbarium shown earlier. And in fact, only very recently, the council announced it had received £30,000 from Historic England towards the ongoing restoration of the columbarium. Last year, Woking Borough Council published its master plan, commissioned from Allies and Morrison, which describes in detail how the site will be developed as a burial ground and as a heritage site. These include plans for a museum, widely referred to as a museum of death, in the media following the publication of the plan. I conclude with details of my 2 major surveys of the cemetery, along with my web address, which can be used to contact me should you need to do so subsequent to today's presentation. Thank you.